My daughter-in-law slapped me in the face and demanded my house keys. And my husband did nothing. Synopsis. It happened in my own kitchen. My daughter-in-law walked in furious, accusing me of interfering in her life. Before I could even understand what was happening, she slapped me across the face and stretched out her hand. "Give me the keys. This house belongs to our family now." I turned to my husband, expecting him to defend me. Say something. Do anything. But he stood there in silence. That was the moment something inside me broke. What neither of them realized was that the house they were so eager to take wasn't just a house. It was the final piece of a legal arrangement they had never bothered to understand. And by the end of that week, the locks changed, and it wasn't me who had to leave. If this story helps you understand that knowing your legal rights is the most powerful protection, please like and subscribe. There are moments when violence reveals exactly who people are beneath the performances they maintain. When physical assault forces you to confront that someone you've tried to accommodate and someone you've trusted to protect you are fundamentally different from who you believed they were. When being struck in your own home by a person who feels entitled to take what's yours creates clarity so sharp and so cold that every subsequent action flows from recognition that you owe these people nothing, beyond what law requires and what your own safety demands. The moment my daughter-in-law Amanda walked into my kitchen and slapped me across the face while demanding I hand over my house keys, the moment my husband Richard stood silent and passive while I was assaulted in the home I legally owned, was the moment when years of trying to maintain family peace and trying to accommodate unreasonable demands collapsed into recognition that I needed to protect myself from people who viewed me as obstacle to be removed, rather than as person deserving of basic respect and safety. What Amanda and Richard didn't know, what they'd never bothered to verify despite their confident assumptions about their entitlement to my property, was that the house they were demanding access to was protected by legal structures they didn't understand and couldn't override, that their attempted intimidation and violence would accomplish nothing except to demonstrate exactly why those protections had been necessary. My name is Margaret Chen, and I'm 68 years old. I'd been married to Richard for 42 years when the incident in my kitchen happened that would end our marriage and would expose the entitled cruelty that had apparently been building in him and in our daughter-in-law for years. While I'd been too focused on maintaining family harmony to recognize how dangerous the situation was becoming. Richard was 70, had been retired for 5 years after career as accountant, was someone I'd believed I knew intimately after 4 decades of marriage, but who would reveal himself to be fundamentally different from who I'd thought he was when tested by conflict between me and our son's wife. Our son Michael was 38, had been married to Amanda for 6 years, had built what appeared from outside to be successful life with good job and comfortable home. Amanda was 35, worked in sales, was ambitious and confident in ways that had initially seemed admirable, but that had progressively revealed themselves to be more about entitlement and manipulation than about genuine capability or work ethic. The house that would become center of conflict was property I'd inherited from my parents 15 years earlier. Modest but well-maintained home in neighborhood that had appreciated significantly over the decades my parents had owned it. When my mother had died and had left the house to me, I'd made strategic decision to place the property in irrevocable trust with me as primary beneficiary during my lifetime, with specific provisions about what would happen to property after my death, and about who would and wouldn't have access to it during my life. The decision to put the house in trust rather than owning it directly had been motivated by desire to protect the asset from potential future claims or complications. If Richard and I divorced, if either of us faced medical expenses or long-term care costs, if there were disputes about inheritance among our children, the trust structure would ensure the house remained protected and would pass according to my wishes rather than being subject to claims from creditors or legal complications from my marriage or estate. Richard had been somewhat resistant to the trust structure when I'd established it, had felt that married couples should own property jointly rather than separately, had interpreted my desire to protect my inheritance as lack of trust in him or in our marriage. But I'd held firm, had explained that the protections were prudent financial planning rather than commentary on our relationship, had maintained the trust structure despite his preference for joint ownership. The pattern that had developed over the 6 years Michael had been married to Amanda was that she had progressively become more demanding and more intrusive into my life and my decisions, had felt entitled to input and control over aspects of my life that were none of her business, had apparently viewed my assets and my property as things that would eventually belong to her and Michael, and that she therefore had some current claim to influence or control. The specific conflict that had led to the assault in my kitchen had begun several weeks earlier, when Amanda had announced that she and Michael wanted to move into my house with me, wanted me to sign over the property to them while I moved into smaller apartment or assisted living facility. They'd framed this demand as being about their concern for me. I was getting older. The house was becoming too much for me to maintain alone. I'd be better off in smaller space where I didn't have to worry about upkeep and maintenance. But the real motivation had been transparent. My house was worth significantly more than the home Michael and Amanda currently owned, was in better neighborhood with better schools, was property they wanted for themselves, and that they'd apparently decided they were entitled to have, regardless of my preferences or my legal ownership. When I'd declined their demand and had explained that I was perfectly capable of maintaining my home and had no intention of moving or of signing over property I'd inherited from my parents, Amanda had become angry and had accused me of being selfish and of not caring about my family's needs. The conflict had escalated over subsequent weeks, with Amanda becoming increasingly aggressive in her demands and increasingly hostile when I'd continued to refuse. She'd started making comments about how the house should belong to the family rather than to me personally, about how I was hoarding assets that could benefit my son and grandchildren, about how my refusal to accommodate their needs demonstrated that I didn't care about family and was being unreasonably controlling. Richard had been largely passive during these escalating conflicts, had avoided taking sides, had encouraged me to be reasonable and to consider what Michael and Amanda were asking for, without explicitly supporting their demands or defending my right to make my own decisions about my property. His neutrality had been frustrating, but I'd attributed it to his general conflict avoidance and his desire to maintain peace with our son, rather than seeing it as indication that he fundamentally didn't support my position or my rights. The assault had happened on Tuesday afternoon when Amanda had shown up at my house unannounced and clearly angry. She'd walked into my kitchen where I'd been preparing dinner and had immediately launched into accusations about me interfering in her life. Apparently, I'd made some comment to Michael about concern I had about their financial management, and Amanda had interpreted this as me trying to control their decisions or to undermine their relationship. Before I'd fully processed what she was angry about or had opportunity to defend myself against her accusations, Amanda had slapped me hard across the face, blow that had been forceful enough to hurt significantly and to leave mark that would be visible for days. And then she'd extended her hand palm up in demanding gesture and had said words that would change everything. "Give me the keys. This house belongs to our family now. You've had your time here and now it's our turn. My children need space to grow up and you're being selfish by keeping this house to yourself when you could live perfectly well somewhere smaller." I'd stood frozen in shock for a moment, my face stinging from the slap, processing that my daughter-in-law had just physically assaulted me in my own kitchen and was now demanding I hand over my house keys, as if she had any right to make that demand, or as if I had any obligation to comply. And then I'd looked at Richard, who'd been standing in the doorway witnessing everything, expecting him to intervene or to defend me or to at minimum tell Amanda that physically assaulting me was absolutely unacceptable behavior regardless of whatever conflict we were having about the house. But Richard had said nothing. Had just stood there looking uncomfortable and passive, not defending me, not condemning Amanda's violence, not asserting my right to my own property or to basic physical safety in my own home. His silence had been more devastating than Amanda's slap, had revealed that when forced to choose between protecting me and avoiding conflict with our son and daughter-in-law, he'd choose passive neutrality that left me vulnerable and undefended. "Get out of my house," I'd said to Amanda, my voice cold and controlled despite the shock and the pain. "You just assaulted me. Leave immediately or I'm calling the police." Amanda had tried to continue arguing, had insisted she had right to the house, and that I was being unreasonable and selfish. But I'd picked up my phone and had started dialing 911, and she'd finally left, slamming the door behind her and shouting threats about how I'd regret not cooperating with their reasonable requests. After Amanda left, I'd turned to Richard and had asked him directly, "Why didn't you defend me? Your daughter-in-law just assaulted me in our kitchen and demanded I give her my house, and you stood there in silence. Why?" Richard had tried to minimize what had happened, had suggested that Amanda had been upset and hadn't really meant to hit me that hard, had said that we all needed to calm down and talk reasonably about the house situation without letting emotions escalate things further. His response had made clear that he fundamentally didn't support my position, that he'd apparently been agreeing with Amanda and Michael that I should sign over my house to them, that his silence during the assault had been because he'd viewed it as family conflict rather than as criminal assault that required his intervention and defense of his wife. The recognition that Richard had chosen Michael and Amanda's entitlement over my safety and my rights had been devastating, but had also created absolute clarity about what I needed to do next. The first thing I did was document the assault. I took photographs of the mark on my face where Amanda had struck me. I called the police to file report even though I knew they probably wouldn't pursue charges for first-time domestic assault between family members. I made sure there was official record that Amanda had physically attacked me in my home. The documentation served multiple purposes. It created evidence that could be used if Amanda escalated her violence. It demonstrated to Richard and to Michael that I was taking the assault seriously and wasn't going to minimize or excuse it. And it established pattern that would support me if I needed to obtain restraining order or take other legal action to protect myself. The second thing I did was consult with the estate planning attorney who'd helped me establish the trust that held my house, explained what had happened and what Amanda and Richard were demanding, asked what protections I had and what options were available to ensure my property remained secure and that I remained safe in my own home. The attorney had been direct about my legal position. The house was in irrevocable trust with me as primary beneficiary. No one could force me to sign it over, or to leave, or to give up my rights to live there during my lifetime. Amanda and Richard had absolutely no legal claim to the property regardless of what they believed they were entitled to. But the attorney had also raised concerning point about my safety. If Richard was siding with Amanda and Michael rather than protecting me, if Amanda was willing to physically assault me and was making demands backed by violence, I needed to consider whether remaining in the house with Richard was safe, or whether I needed to take steps to exclude him from the property to protect myself from continued harassment and potential escalation of violence. The third thing I did was make appointment with divorce attorney to discuss ending my marriage to Richard. The decision was painful after 42 years together. But Richard's silence during Amanda's assault and his subsequent minimization of what had happened had revealed that he fundamentally didn't value my safety or my rights when they conflicted with our son's wants, that he'd choose passive neutrality over protecting me from violence, that I couldn't trust him to be partner who supported me when tested by family conflict. Over the following week, I took systematic action to protect myself and my property. I filed for divorce from Richard, citing his failure to protect me from assault and his support of unreasonable demands for me to sign over my property. I obtained restraining order against Amanda, preventing her from coming to my house or contacting me, based on the documented assault and her threats. I changed all the locks on my house to ensure Richard and Amanda couldn't access it without my permission. I had the trust attorney send formal letter to both Amanda and Richard explaining that the house was in irrevocable trust, that I had exclusive right to occupy it during my lifetime, that any attempts to harass me or to pressure me to sign over the property would be documented and would be grounds for further legal action. The response from Richard and from Michael and Amanda had been shock and anger. They'd apparently believed that their demands were reasonable and that I'd eventually capitulate if they pressured me sufficiently, had never anticipated that I'd take decisive legal action to protect myself and to ensure they couldn't access my property or continue harassing me. Richard had tried to argue that I was overreacting, that filing for divorce after 42 years over one incident was extreme and vindictive. Michael had accused me of choosing property over family, of valuing my house more than my relationship with my son and grandchildren. But I'd been unmoved by their attempts at manipulation and guilt. Amanda had physically assaulted me and had demanded my house keys while Richard stood passive and silent. That wasn't one incident. It was revelation of exactly how they viewed me and what they believed they were entitled to take from me through intimidation and violence. The divorce and the legal protections weren't about choosing property over family. They were about protecting myself from people who demonstrated they valued my property more than they valued my safety or my rights. The divorce proceedings took 18 months to finalize and were contentious in ways I'd expected. Richard fought for share of my house despite it being in trust that predated our marriage, argued that 42 years of marriage entitled him to portion of its value. But the trust structure I'd established 15 years earlier protected the property. It wasn't marital asset subject to division because I didn't own it directly. The trust did, and the trust provisions were clear that only I had rights to occupy and benefit from the property during my lifetime. The final divorce settlement gave Richard no claim to my house, divided our other marital assets relatively equitably, provided him with spousal support that was appropriate given the length of our marriage and our respective financial situations. He'd lost access to the house he'd apparently felt entitled to demand I sign over to our son, had lost the marriage he'd taken for granted, would continue regardless of how poorly he treated me when tested. 3 years after the assault in my kitchen, after divorcing Richard and establishing clear legal boundaries with Amanda and Michael, I'm 71 and living alone in the house my parents left me, the house I protected through careful legal planning and through willingness to end relationship with people who valued my property more than they valued my safety or my rights. Richard lives in smaller apartment, has limited relationship with me, has apparently learned that passivity and failure to protect your spouse when she's assaulted has consequences that include losing the relationship and losing access to everything that came with it. Amanda and Michael have no relationship with me. The restraining order remains in effect. They've made no attempts at reconciliation or apology. They apparently still believe they were entitled to my house, and that I was wrong to refuse their demands and to protect myself from their escalating aggression. Whether they've learned anything about entitlement or about how violence and demands don't create obligations, I don't know and don't particularly care. What I learned from being slapped in my own kitchen while my husband stood silent, from having my house keys demanded by someone who had no right to them, and from the legal actions I took to protect myself and my property, is that knowing your legal rights and having protections in place before crisis occurs is most powerful defense against people who believe they're entitled to take what's yours. That violence and intimidation only work if you don't have legal structures that make their demands unenforceable. That sometimes ending long relationship is necessary price of protecting yourself from people who've demonstrated they don't value your safety or your autonomy. The house Amanda and Richard were so confident they could take from me through demands and violence and manipulation wasn't just house. It was property protected by legal trust they'd never bothered to understand, was asset I'd secured specifically to prevent exactly the kind of exploitation they attempted, was evidence that careful planning and knowledge of your rights can protect you, even when people you should be able to trust reveal themselves to be threats rather than support. The locks changed at the end of that week, but it wasn't me who had to leave. It was Richard who lost access to home he'd taken for granted, was Amanda who discovered that violence doesn't create legal rights, was both of them who learned that underestimating someone's legal preparation and their willingness to protect themselves is an expensive mistake that costs more than they'd ever anticipated paying. My name is Margaret Chen. My daughter-in-law slapped me in my own kitchen and demanded my house keys while my husband stood silent and passive rather than defending me. What neither of them knew was that the house they felt entitled to was protected by irrevocable trust I'd established years earlier specifically to prevent exactly this kind of attempted exploitation. I documented the assault, filed for divorce, obtained restraining order, changed the locks, and ensured that the people who'd tried to intimidate me into giving up my property lost access to everything they'd been taking for granted. The violence revealed exactly who they were. The legal protections I'd put in place years earlier ensured that revelation cost them far more than it cost me. Sometimes the best protection is the one you establish before you need it. The legal structure that makes other people's entitlement and violence powerless against your actual rights. Thank you for reading. If this story helps you understand that knowing your legal rights is the most powerful protection, please like and subscribe.